So we look now to our distinguished panel members to interpret what we've seen in these early months of the Trump administration and the Brexit movement. So I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce our panel members. As you know, the detailed biographies are in your materials, so I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights. So our first speaker will be Grant King, and many of you will know that Grant is the president of the BCA. He comes with very deep global experience, and particularly in the energy sector. Justin Brown is Deputy Secretary at DFAT, and again has extensive global experience, and primarily in trade and trade negotiations. And then we have Dr. Geoff Raby, who also has a very distinguished career in DFAT and was the Australian ambassador in China between 2007-2011. And in 2011, he resigned and established his own firm, which now provides consulting advice, not only to Australian companies, but also to Chinese companies who are wanting to globalise. So has quite a unique perspective on what the Chinese are thinking about our current circumstances. So what I'd like to do now is throw a question to each of the panellists, and I'd invite them all to respond to the same question. And the first question is, in broad terms, how do we maximise trade and investment outcomes for Australia in the current environment? And as a subset to that question, firstly, what is the role for business in this environment? And then what is the role for government? So, Grant.
So the shortest answer to the question is be competitive, but I'd like to flesh that out a little bit with some facts and figures. And just to begin with, the importance of trade generally. So 40% of Australia's GDP roughly is represented by inbound and outbound trade. Similar for China, 40%, about 27% for the US, and about half of the US, I understand, is with its terrestrial neighbours. So Australia does not have the choice that the US might have in the short term of becoming a bit protectionist if that's what the popular issues demand. We have no choice to be an open and competitive economy. We're very reliant on trade. Of the outbound trade, and not surprisingly Australia, and businesses in Australia are a producer of all of the capital-intensive goods, the mining products, and a lot of the large-scale agricultural activities, and even tourism and education are big capital investment businesses these days. The other fact that's interesting is that about 90% of the exports that we make as a country are provided through Australia's largest business enterprises. So our exports are very dependent on those large business enterprises. But in turn, those exports are funded effectively with foreign capital. So there's about $5.5 trillion of stock, if you like, in Australia, and about 60% is actually foreign investment. And it's not quite right to say this. I'm sure the pure economists in the room will debate this point, but you can think of about half of that 5 or 6% of that 5.5 trillion being roughly a third equity and a two-thirds debt. And we all know we can't fund everything with debt. We need some risk capital in there, some equity. And so the reason the answer to your question is competitive is that business has really deployed the capital which has driven the large export opportunities in Australia and will most likely continue to do so. And business needs competitive conditions to attract that capital. And one of the things we find in the BCA is that those suppliers of foreign capital are becoming increasingly concerned about the attractiveness of investment in Australia. We are having, or we are seeing, if we look ahead, less and less competitive tax rates, for example. We talk about Brexit in the UK, but UK is already on a path to 15% corporate tax rates. The US has yet to legislate, but is on a path to lower tax and equity, and that's why I've drawn that point about equity. Foreign direct investments, effectively equity, if you'd like to think about it that way, will go wherever the returns are best. So we have to maintain a competitive environment in order to attract the capital, to develop the resources, to export and to drive an export-led economy. There are other things in our domestic economy, and when you talk about the role of business and the role of government, the role of business has been to raise and deploy capital and apply their skills to drive those exports. But the role of government is to create an environment that makes sure we have a competitive situation to do it. Clearly our corporate tax rates is just one of many, many important issues. But the regulatory environment in Australia is seen by overseas investors as becoming increasingly complex and very lengthy to go through approval processes. The contested nature of large-scale investment in resource projects is a significant deterrent to overseas investors. It takes a long time to get approvals for projects. The regulatory, and that's in large part a function of the regulatory environment, for example, and the risk around investment, particularly when you're deploying large amounts of capital on long-life capital projects. There are significant risks about making that investment, particularly in respect of schedule and the time taken to bring those investments into production and generate earnings. So Australia is seen to be becoming a more risky environment for that investment, yet that investment is critical to driving the development of Australia's wonderful resources, both natural resources in terms of minerals and energy, but of course our agricultural resources and our tourism assets, and of course more recently the development of a great education industry here in Australia as well. Locally, and my final point is we have to be competitive as well, because in a competitive world we have no choice in respect of trade to meet the competition, particularly in our resources sectors. But in order to do that, we're always driving costs down. That has impacts on employment, and clearly reducing costs to remain competitive in a falling commodity price environment is critical. So it's also critical in Australia that we generate new jobs and new export opportunities, and the policies that we need from government to do that go very much around the flexibility of our workplaces, our capacity to innovate, our education system, all of those things able to work in a way that allows Australia to create new jobs and new opportunities to export as well.
Thanks, Grant. Justin?
Thanks, Stephanie. So Grant's covered the domestic environment. I'm going to talk externally about some of the issues that'll impact on our interests, both defensive and offensive. And you won't be surprised to know that I think the situation in the US is probably the most significant factor that's changed since last November in terms of the global trade agenda. And stating the obvious to say that the US approach to trade is now far less predictable, far less linear. In many respects, we've seen, based on the first 100 or so days of the Trump administration, a retreat from the US's long-standing role as an advocate for the rules-based system, and we're seeing that being played out in the various international processes underway at the moment. So we believe that for the rest of this year we'll see the administration focusing on a number of issues. NAFTA renegotiation will probably be their highest priority, and that'll be a test as to how the administration implements some of the rhetoric and tweets that you've seen emanating from the administration. I think we'll see a continuation of the 100-day program that Trump and President Xi agreed in Mar-a-Lago. That'll probably be succeeded by more of those types of frameworks, and the success of those will depend, I think, on will determine in many respects whether that relationship deteriorates. Administration's very enthusiastic about an FTA with Japan, and I'll talk about the TPP in a moment, but that's clearly a long-term crusade that will, I think, expect the Americans to move on that for the remainder of this year. And finally, and you will have all been aware of the administration's blizzard of executive orders and presidential memoranda launching all manner of reviews and so on. We expect to see a large amount of enforcement actions, which is trade speak for anti-dumping, countervailing duties and other sorts of punitive measures against countries that are deemed to be implementing unfair trading practices. So I think for us, for Australia, the defensive side of this equation is very significant. We've got a lot of work to do to even protect our interest in the US market, let alone to protect the global trading system. I would argue that our core approach ought to involve the following broad objectives. One, to protect the rules-based system. It's served us well. In many respects, we're a price taker in the global trading environment, so we need rules. Without rules, we're faced with trading conditions which favour the economically strongest and disadvantage the rest of us. I think we should also continue, as Grant has said, the trade liberalising momentum that the government has already put in place through free trade agreements and various other measures. Clearly, we're going to have to build coalitions with other countries to keep the trade liberalising caravan rolling. The days are gone when nothing could happen without the US, but it's still the case the US is an important player, so we are going to have to build coalitions to get things done. We're also going to have to enforce our rights, and by that I mean we do have legal rights in the WTO and under our free trade agreements. We're going to have to make sure that our partners live up to their obligations so that we see the benefits flow from the agreements. And we're going to have to embark on a big exercise to ensure that the social licence for trade liberalisation continues. I'll talk a little bit more about architecture, but I might just make one final remark about the TPP, because this is a big part of the government's agenda for dealing with some of this volatility that I've just described around the US position. So you'd all be aware of the basic situation we face. The Americans have withdrawn from the TPP. Now the remaining 11 are looking at whether we can bring the agreement into force without the US. In Hanoi a couple of weeks ago, the 11 agreed to begin a process to develop options and to report to ministers in November on what those options might look like. And I'm personally optimistic that we will be able to get an agreement that will make the TPP come into force. It won't be TPP 12, it'll be something else, but it will look a lot like TPP 12, and it will have, we hope, as many of the original signatories as possible, and we believe that's an important part of the architectural story that the government's telling about the economic integration of the region and the need to keep the US engaged. Thanks.
Geoff.
Thanks, Stephanie. Lot's already been covered with those two excellent presentations. To start with, Grant on the domestic and Justin on the international. Maybe I'm a bit polyanderish, but there's an old adage that goes, things are never as bad as they seem, nor as good as you hope. And I think we may be in that sort of world, whilst I acknowledge the points Justin has made about the uncertainty and unpredictability of the new administration in the US and the implications of that for Australian trade and business. I think there have been some quite encouraging signs, including, as you mentioned in your introduction, Stephanie, of the 10-point trade arrangement. It's not necessarily beneficial to Australia because I think, as you pointed out, especially in the case of chilled beef, but also LNG, we will face quite a lot of competition in the China market from the US, which wasn't there before. I think one of the brighter spots around all that, and I know we're talking about business and commerce, but I do think so far so good on Trump and the management of the China relationship. If you compare what's been happening to the rhetoric during the election, things aren't nearly as bad as we feared, but that could still happen. I think China is still taking its measure of Trump, and while we talk about China, it's obviously very important given the huge amount of our trade that goes to China. Brexit offers, I think, a really good chance to rebuild a global coalition with the UK around advocacy for global trade liberalisation. I mean, the notion that you find in the popular media that somehow Brexit is part of a populist anti-globalisation, anti-trade is quite odd if you look at what the Prime Minister has been saying. The one thing is for sure is that it's anti-free movement of people, and you link free movement of people in your introductory remarks. And I think that's also a big issue for the Australian government as well. But putting that to one side, I think one's hearing from the Conservative government, and if it's returned, we'll hear more of that, quite a strong stance in favour of global trade liberalisation. And that's something Australia needs to get alongside and support, including through our own possibilities of bilateral FTA. One other area that is happening that's very important for us in Australian business is the articulation of a whole new narrative by President Xi Jinping of China, the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the grand narrative and the grand strategy of China, which has a lot of purposes. It's not just one thing or another, but principally it's a way of recycling vast amounts of foreign exchange reserves into things other than treasuries in the US. China has built up a tremendous capacity in infrastructure, and they're now looking for a vent for that surplus capacity, and the One Belt, One Road is all about building infrastructure. And there are some strategic dimensions to it, although I don't think the worrywarts in Canberra have quite got the balance right, seeing this as a nefarious attempt by China to impose a Sino-centric world order. But certainly there is a need to be mindful that there are geopolitical elements to this. But this does offer something that Australian business need to be involved with, tremendous opportunities both in Australia through attracting Chinese capital into big infrastructure activities such as Northern Australia, but also the opportunity to work alongside China in third countries on infrastructure, such as, for example, Papua New Guinea, as long as it can be badged and labelled as being part of One Belt, One Road. But I might just stop at that point and see if that segues into your next question.
Thank you very much, Geoff, and to the panel. One of the assumptions that I think we make about our position globally is that our brand is clear in the marketplace. As I said, clean, green and safe, and people keep reciting clean, green and safe to me since I joined Austrade, but I only hear it in Australia. As part of the Foreign Policy White Paper consultation, there have been a number of submissions to that consultation that are calling for a clearer brand. And some of our prominent Australians who head global companies have also been saying that Australia is starting to slip off the map. So my question is, how important is our brand, and are our assumptions about being globally well known for being innovative, being smart, young, hands-on? Does the world actually see Australia like that? Or, as one of my colleagues said, if people in the US are asked to describe Australia in one word, the first word that comes to mind is beer. If they're asked to describe Australia in 2 words, they say spiders and snakes. So that's clearly not the brand values that we want to promote. So has Australia become increasingly invisible in this really competitive global economy? So, Grant.
Thanks again, Stephanie. So the clean, green, safe is an expression used, and as a marketer might think about brand, those might be words that come to mind. I think in my experience, and the experience that's recounted to me by members of the BCA, words like reliable, predictable and competitive are probably better descriptors of Australia's brand. I was just reflecting with Geoff earlier, and I didn't know this, but 10 years ago Geoff kicked off a process which has resulted in a forum called the Australia-China Business Leaders Forum. It took quite some years to come to fruition, and I had the pleasure of chairing that a month or 2 ago. And I just want to put in perspective Australia's relationship with China, because it's gone through 4 phases. They needed our resources, so we exported resources, and we started to buy their manufactured goods. And I don't think brand mattered very much then. They looked through a lot of those underlying issues. They needed the resources, we wanted the goods. But as the trade relationship grows to Australian investment in China and Chinese investment in Australia, those issues are becoming critical. And, for example, from a Chinese perspective, what are the rules? And Justin talked about rules, the rules of trade. What are the rules around foreign investment in Australia? They're quite unpredictable from a Chinese perspective. We talk about sovereign risk, and the thing about business is that often small events become apocryphal. So cancelling a road project in Victoria or trying to impose retrospective taxes like a mining tax are enormously damaging to a brand which used to be around a reliable, predictable supplier of products. And as the relationship or the trade relationships mature into investment, people are going to want to make sure that they can get a predictable return on their investment. So you start to change tax regimes, you start to lengthen approval cycles, you increase project risk because it's hard to get projects approved. I think these are the things that are damaging Australia's brand. I don't think Australia's reputation as a wonderful country is at all damaged. But at the end of the day, when you start investing billions and billions and billions of dollars in an environment which is seeming to be more capricious, that is what is damaging Australia's brand.
Very interesting. So, Justin.
I'd agree very strongly with what Grant said. I think we need to kind of distinguish this discussion a little bit. We're talking about our international reputation in a commercial sense, in which case I think a lot of the points that Grant makes about how the foreign investment regime works and other perceptions of the business environment are quite important. Or are we talking in a more of sort of cultural branding, which might have some commercial spin-offs? And I guess I'd raise a couple of points. First of all, I think it's very desirable that we have a clear national brand, or a badge, if you like. It's a lot easier for small countries. You can see the Kiwis and the Danes and some of those countries. It's much easier for them to specialise and to define the sort of brand of their country in a way that resonates quite clearly. For larger countries, I think it's more of a challenge. I think in a practical sense, one of the issues is how to avoid, if you introduce a national brand, how do you avoid diminishing the value of existing brands? A number of industries and sectors already have quite well-established brands. Now, I'm not saying they can't coexist with a national brand, but you do need to think through how a national brand might coexist and relate to some of those. Some of those existing brands are quite valuable. So I think that's important. I think a second point I'd make is services trade is becoming more important for us. It's already a huge part of our economy and it's a growing part of our export mix. It's harder to find a brand that fits the sheer diversity and complexity of the services sector. Clean and green, I don't think cuts it if you're talking about the professional services sector or business services. So how do you get a brand that's got commercial meaning, that does extend beyond merchandise trade into services and technology and investment and all the other parts of the value chains that we're currently talking about. And I think thirdly, and this isn't really controversial at all, who's going to pay for it and who's going to administer it?
Very good questions. Geoff.
Indeed. Your introductory comment, Stephanie, about snakes and spiders being the two words Americans use reminds me of when I was ambassador in China. I always saying to Tourism Australia, when they do the wonderful natural scenes in the beaches of Australia and Kakadu and all of that, I always say, I've actually never really met a Chinese person that wants to be chased by a crocodile, eaten by a shark, and I've certainly never met a Chinese woman that wants to lie on the beach and get burnt and turn brown. So you have to pitch it differently, and I think Tourism Australia has actually caught up with all of that, and are adopting a much more urban-based, sophisticated representation and presentation of Australia. And I think doing a very good job on all that. And you see it in our tourist numbers. I think just living in China for over 10 years now, there's no doubt in my mind that the clean green brand, whilst, as Justin says, is limited when you look at services, and services trade's growing very quickly, and the services sector in China is now more than 52% of GDP, which is just remarkable. And that shows how much income's growing and the structural change that's flowing from that. And why that's important for us, it goes to these issues quite directly. It goes through to people who are sophisticated and come here for high-end tourism because they have heard about this interesting place, Australia. Clean green means very expensive food on the supermarket shelves in China, and people are paying for it and will pay for it and continue to do so as incomes rise. And of course their own safety standards are so terrible and no one trusts their own food that if you can buy foreign food, particularly if it comes from Australia, that's far preferable than the local stuff. And I think these are reinforcing messages. People come here as students from China, for example, and they experience life here. They come as tourists, and similarly, and it reinforces, and these messages go back. The most important thing across all these areas, not only that we continue to be competitive suppliers, but that our own regulatory standards are such that we don't undermine that image. The image and the brand, I think, is actually quite well established. The thing is, once you're on that pedestal, it's very easy to fall off if the domestic regulatory framework and everything is not working in a way that people understand in Australia that there's a very big issue here. It's not just about cutting a corner here or there. It can severely damage a very big area of commercial interest for Australia if we don't manage it well.
No, I certainly agree with that, and provenance around our food being a very important issue. Now, what I'd like to do is to throw it open to the floor. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So who would like to go first?
My name's Simon DeBell from ABB. I'm interested in the panel's view on how the situation on the Korean Peninsula could have an impact on Australia's trade, given China, South Korea and Japan are all very important trading partners.
Who'd like to take this one?
Justin.
Of course. Yeah, I'm very comfortable answering that question. Impact on our trade. Well, I guess it depends on what happens, to state the obvious. In a way, it's already had a perversely positive effect because the DPRK situation's played into US-China trade relations in a way that really none of us had expected, and as in Trump's unique way, he sees the transactional approach involving sort of greater US contribution, greater Chinese contribution on DPRK, and the US agreeing to moderate some of their hardline demands on trade. So, I think I wouldn't say that's likely to be an enduring feature, but I think it's been something we've noticed initially. Look, I think it's clearly going to have a major impact on China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea in the near term. The markets and the international trading regime do not like volatility and uncertainty, let alone sort of existential security threats. So it's hard to see it as anything other than an adverse issue at the moment.
Okay, we might go to our next question.
John Kunkel from Rio Tinto. Two quick questions. The first is around, I think Justin used the term social licence for trade liberalisation, and maybe just asking panellists to reflect on the domestic debate and context in that regard. I mean, we had a reform era where the organising idea was really the world didn't owe us a living. Now, some people have said that's mercantilist, but it basically did the job for the times and allowed governments to provide the foundations for taking difficult decisions. It doesn't seem like we have an organising narrative explaining to the Australian public what the domestic foundations and why we have to do certain things to maintain our competitiveness. So what's, in your view, what's missing there? And the second one quickly is around, I guess, coalitions of the willing and Justin's point about who Australia partners with to sort of negotiate through these difficult waters. I mean, are the natural allies the likes of Japan, Singapore, Chile, New Zealand? I mean, is there a new phase of activism that's necessary to actually get through this next period of uncertainty?
Two very good questions.
I mean, I'll just make one reflection. I'm not sure it's going to answer your question, but I think one of the issues is that Australia has historically, in my view, had a very open and very liberal approach to exports of natural resources, and I can specifically talk about the gas industry and LNG as an example, although I'm sure it'll be true in iron ore and a lot of our other great resources. And that is essentially there's very little in the way of export controls or export tests that had to be met. So the presumption was we were blessed with these resources, the nation would prosper. They're the people's resources, they're our country's resources, the nation will prosper if we make them available to the world. I think the risk is that if we draw back from that, so clearly in Australia we're seeing a significant debate at the moment about gas and whether we should be keeping some of it for ourselves. The problem is it's too late to have that debate because we've already made the investment, $200 billion of investment to export that resource to customers who rely on its reliable dispatch and delivery. So I think the risk is that we've had a very open economy from a trade point of view, and the risk is whether we become protective of our resources from a domestic perspective and start to impose upon that openness more restrictions, which I think would be very unfortunate because I think all the numbers, including some of Stephanie's opening numbers, would show that the Australian community has benefited enormously from the development of our resources and the provision of those resources to the world. So if we need a new licence, well, I don't know whether we need a new, but we need to prevent going backwards and starting to impose controls on things which I think have demonstrably been to the benefit of the Australian community, which is giving the world access to an incredible legacy of resources, both natural and agricultural.
I think we haven't talked much about Brexit, but in some ways some of the themes that emerged in the Brexit referendum, you can see them here in the trade debate, a sort of a scepticism about institutions, certainly a scepticism about the political class, desire to reassert our economic sovereignty. Some of these are echoes that we're seeing in the trade debate here. I agree with you, John, that the kind of, if you like, clear clearly articulated national interest debate that occurred in the 80s around those reforms. That's not present at the moment. And I think what we're seeing instead is really a debate, not a particularly coherent one yet, about globalisation and how far we want it to go as a country and what that means in a policy sense. I think that's kind of what's happening here. And I think the US, in electing the Trump administration, has made one set of judgments about trying to revive Rust Belt jobs and to correct bilateral trade deficits and various other things. In the UK, they've made a series of other judgments, and I think every country will have a slightly different approach to tackling this question, and that makes coherence in the multilateral international trading arena quite difficult. So I think that's the first comment I make. I think the second comment I make, which was on your question of coalition building, my own feeling is, we have made something of an art form out of coalition building in the trade space. For those of you who are old enough to remember, the Cairns Group was something which we launched in the 80s, and we still use coalitions very actively. I think the more fragmented the system becomes, though, the more shifting and diverse the coalitions need to become as well. I haven't talked at all about the WTO, just to spare you all the gloom and doom, but really we're now faced with to use a classic DFAT phrase, variable geometry, where lots and lots of different things are happening in lots of different groupings, and we have to cut our cloth to meet that. That means lots of different coalitions. So of course the TPP is in many ways a classic coalition. We share a certain vision of what economic integration ought to look like, and there's other variations on that. So I think Geoff's mentioned the UK as a potential partner. Rhetoric is good. There's lots of high sort of soaring rhetoric even in potential coalition partners. When you get into hard economic commitments around trade liberalisation, that's where some of these coalitions can prove to be somewhat wobbly. So I think our objectives are pretty clear. Finding coalition partners is going to be a key objective moving forward.
Yeah, I obviously agree with all that, but I'm glad Justin didn't bore you with the WTO, because I'm about to do that. Look, Chris Bowen, Shadow Treasurer, gave a very interesting speech in March at the National Press Club, and he talked about moving forward with multilateral trade negotiations on the basis of coalition of the willing, that you don't have to have all, whatever it is, just 186 members these days going along. And already, over the last couple of years, there have been agreements on services and so on which have involved subgroups of the WTO. And so I think that is helpfully moving away from all in or all out type of agreements. And this idea goes back a long way. We started talking about it in 1999 when the Seattle ministerial talks collapsed, when we failed to launch around then. And it would have been much better had we launched around in 99 than in 2001 when we did at Doha. The conditions, I think, were better, but for various reasons it collapsed. And then we started talking about coalitions of the willing for even full multilateral rounds. And for those that can't cut the grade, join the negotiations, unable to go to that level of liberalisation, you just give it to them on an MFN basis in any case, because most of those countries don't matter at all in terms of share of world trade. So there are issues with the US Congress and reciprocity. It's not a straightforward thing, but the WTO is actually making progress in some of these areas with subgroup type of agreements, and I don't think we ought to just write the WTO off. Not that Justin was doing that, it's just it's boring. I know it's very boring. That's right. So there are all sorts of possibilities, and as Justin said, we've got a great tradition in Australia of coalition building within these multilateral bodies and organisations, and Australia will continue to play a very big role in these bodies doing those sorts of things.
If I could just have a quick reply. I think we need to think of our FTA partners as coalitions, and I say that because our ultimate goal is to knit together all of our FTAs into some sort of regional wide architecture which creates the most seamless business environment that we can manage. So in a way, although they're not called coalitions, they're something different, they are, in effect, countries with a like-minded approach to trade liberalisation. I think, and just on Geoff's point, of course he's right. The big difference now, though, is that the US is not interested in plurilaterals. They're not interested in the WTO. They're not interested in anything that might look different to a bilateral approach. So for plurilaterals to work, they need to have a critical mass of countries. You take the US out of the equation, very little is going to fly. So we do face a significant problem in getting even plurilateral, sort of, if you like, subset of WTO membership to move forward on issues of interest. And that is, you know, in a way, one of the biggest downsides of the US decision to go bilateral.
Thank you very much. And we're just drawing to a close, but because we've got such a distinguished panel, I really want to take advantage of the individuals we have here. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and that is, if Australia could do one thing to boost its stocks in the new global trading order, what would that be? So, Grant.
Well, for me, it ends where the conversation begun. We're a country with a small domestic economy and a wealth of resources, both natural and people and skills. So we have to be an open, competitive economy and do all of those things that allow us to remain competitive. The world is getting more competitive around us. Capital is getting more mobile. So for me, it's competitiveness.
Yeah, open, competitive economy. Justin?
I think I agree. I think we clearly need that. If we don't have an open and competitive economy, then we're in more trouble than the early explorers. I think the other thing I'd sort of add to that list is TPP 11, and here I think I say that because it has two major advantages over bilaterals. First, it gives us preferential access to a number of markets which are, in a commercial sense, very valuable. It creates a seamless business environment. By that I mean it creates a sort of a common regulatory zone in many respects. So if you look at things as arid as rules of origin and so on, you are talking about a zone where trade and investment within that zone is relatively low cost compared to bilaterals. And thirdly, it is something which I believe has value as a way of drawing the US back into a meaningful conversation about the pathway to economic integration in Asia, because fundamentally our interest is in keeping the two parts of the Asia-Pacific together. We don't want East Asia and North America separated in a discriminatory way that's sort of completely contrary to our interests.
Thank you very much. And lastly, Geoff.
Probably what I'm saying is not probably, it is what Grant's saying, but look, one word is productivity. I come in and out of Australia a lot over the last 6 years or so, and I drop in Australia and 1 month there's some trivial issue. It might be backpackers tax. It might be important for the individuals involved. And then there's another trivial issue, and you can think of them all yourself. And so I get these slices of the public discourse and debate in Australia. And over the years, it's really quite depressing because we don't have a narrative about productivity and growing productivity. And if there is a narrative in Australia, it's about distribution and redistribution. And until there's a productivity, there's nothing to distribute. And I do think we need to get back to a national discourse absolutely focused on the whole issue of productivity. And the last thought I'd leave you with is, you know, people think of China as being a state-owned economy and all that. The private sector accounts for 75% of GDP now. And it is unbelievably competitive and fierce. And I'm not saying we have to live that life, but that is the reality. And the only way we can position ourselves is by continuing to have the policies to raise productivity across the whole economy.
Thank you very much. So this afternoon we've been very privileged to be able to listen to three very distinguished panellists who have given very deep thought to their responses, and I'd like you to join me in thanking them.